everyone, and welcome to this lunchtime talk as part of Real Estate Live UK. As part of our focus on creating sustainable places, we're delighted to welcome Chris Grigg, OBE, Chairman of the new UK Infrastructure Bank, who's in discussion with Paul Norman, the editor of Costar News. Just before we start, and while I can see some of you are still just making it into the room, I'd just like to remind you this is a Q&A session and we're delighted to accept your questions, which will be put forward to Chris. So please can you use the Q&A panel so that we can see all your questions, and we'll try to get through them as many of them as we can. So thank you very much for joining us, and I will hand over to Paul.
Thank you. Hi all, I'm Paul Norman, editor of Costar News, the leading commercial real estate daily bulletin. I'm here today with Chris, as you've heard, Chris Grigg, with more than 30 years experience across the real estate and financial services industries. Chris here to talk about his new job as chair of the UK Infrastructure Bank after I believe he took up the reins in May. He's held a range of leadership roles, including chief executive of Barclays Commercial Bank, and of course, until recently, for all of us in real estate, at British Land, the leading UK REIT. He is setting the strategic direction of the bank, which is headquartered in Leeds, as it looks to unlock more than 40 billion of financing for key projects across the UK, with a priority being investments in projects that help tackle climate change and drive the levelling up agenda, as it's known. So, Chris, without further ado, can you tell us more about the role at the UK Infrastructure Bank you have and what the bank's role is, particularly how it relates to the real estate and regeneration sectors?
Thanks very much, Paul. I was just thinking you've done such a good job of introducing me. I'm not quite sure how I respond incrementally, as it were, to your questions. But you're right. I'm the chair. I've been of the bank. I've been the chair since, call it May, and I did work for the Treasury before that, helping to set up the bank, to work out how to set it up. We are today operational. We announced very recently that we were hiring our first permanent chief executive, John Flint, and he has just started. Actually, he started a week ago. So we feel that we are moving at pace to be fully operational. Clearly, we won't be fully operational for a while. We have to add people. We will eventually be subject to statute rather than the slightly temporary arrangements we have to boot today. But we're able to operate. We're able to lend. We're able to contribute capital. So we feel we're up and running, which is really important. And as you said, our two missions are, and they're distinct, but there are two of them, though I'm sure from time to time they will overlap, with respect to local and regional growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, driving towards net zero, both of which I think are critical things for the future of this country.
Okay, so on the second rather than first one of them, how is the bank supporting the sustainability agenda, particularly in mind of the big COP26 meeting that's coming up as well? Are you contributing to that, and how, other than that, are you supporting the sustainability agenda?
Sure. Well, as I said, it's early days, so I suspect that whether we've actually lent any money by the time of COP26, I certainly I think the chances are maybe 50-50, maybe a bit lower. So we certainly won't have made a material impact by the time COP26 comes around. On the other hand, this is part of the broader work with respect to the government moving in this direction. And for ourselves, it will be about endeavouring to contribute capital, whether that's through lending, whether that's through other other pieces of the capital stack where we can contribute. And as you touched on, where we'll be endeavouring to use an expression I don't always particularly like, but to crowd in other institutions, to really to put ourselves in a place where perhaps, the commercial sector isn't yet. That's going to be one of the key aspects of that which we do across the board. We will be working with local authorities as well as the private sector.
So in terms of the types of projects the bank's going to look to invest in, could you tell us a bit more about that as well? I mean, obviously you touched on it a lot there, but drilling into what will come across your desk that will particularly be of interest.
Well, I think in some ways, we're going to be two things, if you will. We will be contributing over time towards the policy agenda, but we'll also be demand driven. I mean, where are transactions which are fundamentally bankable coming from that hit our two policy items. So for sure, this is an infrastructure bank, so there'll be pieces of infrastructure which are, if you like, that things like ports, would be a great example. Pieces of infrastructure that can enable, but as I say, both local and regional growth, but also, if there are areas where we're able to contribute towards net zero, so much the better. So, in many ways, part of that will be around the new technologies which are emerging, which will be required for us to hit what, after all, are fairly ambitious goals from a time perspective.
Indeed. And just to say, anyone who wants to send in questions as well, we'll be picking them up audience questions. So please, I should have mentioned that earlier. What's the process then for securing funding via the UK Infrastructure Bank, both for the private sector and local authorities?
Well, first of all, from our perspective, we have access to Treasury funding, to government funding. So it's a relatively straightforward process for us. You'll be aware that organisations like the EIB, actually borrow in the capital markets. We will have that power, but it's unlikely, at least in the early years, that we need to use that, as I say, because of access directly to government funding. So in terms of, how do people access our funding in turn, then that really will be, if you like, in a somewhat traditional banking way. People will apply to us. Obviously, there'll be areas that we want to get involved in. We're currently building relationships with the relevant parties, whether that be in the public or the private sector. But at the end of the day, it will be about, looking at proposals, working to make them bankable. From our perspective, we'd expect to be taking perhaps a bit more risk than others would be, but making those propositions fundamentally bankable, whether, as I say, they're in, wherever they come on the capital stack. And then they will go through a process in much the same way as you were going through a process with a commercial bank.
And when does the bank, you mentioned that you've got a new chief executive starting this week, or has started. When does the bank become fully operational? Is it reliant on some government actually giving you the resources now and the details of the terms and all the rest of it? Or is it already operational, just to say? Well,
I would say from a practical perspective, the bank is operational. I'd hesitate to say it was fully operational because obviously, we don't, we're adding people quickly, but we certainly, there are a range of skills and forms of teamwork that will take a while to build before we can claim to be fully operational, before we can, if you will, take on transactions at the rate we will aspire to. But can we lend money today? Yes, we can. Are we looking at live transactions? Yes, we are. And in terms of people, we're up to 50, 60 people now. Some of them are on secondment, some of them are on temporary contracts, as you might imagine, to get moving quickly. But over time, people will come in from private and public sector. I must say, what we have found already is considerable excitement at the opportunity. This is effectively a startup, which is something that a lot of people aspire to be part of, obviously. Yeah. And at the same time, our mission statements are something that many people find both intriguing and something they want to be part of. So we've had a lot of interest already from people wanting to come and at least talk to us and indeed join us. As I say, we're 50 or 60 people.
I've had a first question in. Charles Palmer, will the bank be investing in nuclear energy generation? Has that already been decided?
That certainly that has not been decided. I'm only laughing because when you see the size and scale of financing required for nuclear, whichever way you cut it, it's a very large amount of money. We've got a decent sized balance sheet, but I think the funding required would be more than we on our own could manage. So that'll be something to be decided over time.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about real estate as well within that. In terms of the wider real estate sector, obviously you're a key figure in that for a long time now. How positive are you about progress that's being made in terms of ESG and sustainability and reaching net zero targets? And I guess, I'd ask you, what sort of projects and initiatives have you been impressed by and that you sort of think, well, that's something we'd like to be involved with?
Well, if you look across the broader real estate segment, there are certainly areas that we won't be involved in at all. For example, Homes England, I think, are doing a great job in many ways in driving that forward. So it wouldn't be sensible for us to try and trample on their turf. Another, experienced real estate person as chair of that organisation. But we clearly wouldn't want to be confusing ourselves or indeed anybody else by being involved in that segment. Do I think that regeneration projects, which have things other than resi in them, could be something we've been involved in if they hit our target, in our areas? Yes, for sure. Do I think that the industry has made huge strides over the next 3 years? Over the last 3 years? Yes, I do. I mean, I think I would say that the sector generally has done well. There are certain really profound issues which haven't been solved. Whether that's the use of materials like concrete and glass, which have been mainstays of the industry for a long, long time. Still fully, we haven't gone wholly beyond that yet, for sure. And then, if you look at the needs of moving away within the residential sector, moving away from gas heating is something that everybody's talking about, but that's a hard thing to do. And how you replace that, is that is that hydrogen? Is that through other forms of technology? All those questions have to be answered. Some of which will fall inside our ambit, if you will, in some way.
Yeah, I mean, it's often said, well, not least by the real estate industry itself, if there's one sector that has a massive impact on the UK achieving net zero, will be real estate. So I guess it clearly is a key area for you in the bank.
But some of that will be, as I say, directly, potentially, but also potentially a lot of that will be indirectly in terms of creating, new forms of energy generation that can help to solve some of those problems kind of at source. So if you look at, one of the I think the great successes actually of the public sector coming in early to a sector, and then that sector becoming sort of private sector orientated, was offshore wind, where originally, there was a degree of subsidization and so forth, and now we're moving to a different place. If you think looking forward, whether that's to floating wind, to use the kind of one of those technologies that people are really starting to look heavily at, could there potentially be a place for us? Does that move through into generation of electricity, for domestic and other sectors? Yeah, of course it does.
Okay, I've had another question in. It's from Adam Jones here. Will your funding be given to bespoke one-off projects alone, or also frameworks with multiple projects created in the public or private sector, or both? I suspect you're going to say both.
I'm not sure if that ends up with, it's one of those quadrant diagrams that you find there's more than 4 quadrants. One of the things we will be thinking about is obviously, if we find that there are particular technology, as an example, if there are technologies, and wind is one that obviously is quoted a lot as being a success area, that you could replicate a number of times and eventually have the private sector more and more involved, so that we didn't have to be involved. That would almost be the poster case, or the of what we would want to achieve. If we find that in other places, terrific. I think there will be thematics to our investment over time. But does that mean that everything has to be thematic? No, not at all. And I think the other aspect is we will want to experiment a little bit and to find those things. And look, not all of them will work. We will be taking a bit more risk from time to time than others. And of course, as is always, everybody likes the idea. When you say to people something's risky, they all go, yeah, Chris. And then when it actually risks to be bad, but we just lost money. That's what risk is. And I'm sure we'll have to live some of that, which will be a shock to everybody who thought when we gave the risk speech that we were just making it up.
Yes, well, we'll look out for that. I've got a question here. It starts off quite personal, but it's a good question as well as coming. Someone's saying, I have a domestic air source heat pump for my home. So bear with me here. One of the biggest issues I have found is finding quality servicing contractors to maintain what has been a very expensive install. has the bank considered the maintenance of green investment?
I think I won't say this very often, hopefully, but on this particular occasion, I will hide slightly behind that we've only been operating a few months.
Yeah, no, fair
There's
enough.
a certain. Do I think that we will end up lending directly to servicing companies? I don't think that's really what an infrastructure bank does, certainly in its early days. Do I think there will be some, projects that might involve, large-scale heat pumps that are then used in, cities, those sorts of things? Hey, maybe. But I think, do I think the public sector, and that's, I suspect, where we might be involved. And this is only a might. As I say, discussions are only really just starting. But you could see a situation where, that those installations might well be better done by or at least driven by the public sector as well as the private sector.
Okay. Now, it's often said as well that it's the kind of banks and lending community, when they can really drive change in terms of, what they come up with in terms of their demands. Particularly from the real estate industry. I just wanted to get your sense, and obviously you've been involved in borrowing and talking to banks and being a banker as well.
Both sides of the balance sheet.
all sides. What initiatives from lenders at the moment, and over the last, you mentioned the last 3 years when it's really begun to change, I guess, in particular are helping to drive change, do you think, Chris?
I don't think there's any doubt but that an awful lot of institutions have grasped the importance of ESG generally, of climate change, of net zero, kind of getting more particular. And I think that is making now quite a big difference to the ways that the capital markets operate. I use the capital markets broadly. Whether you go from governments issuing green bonds, companies issuing green bonds, to organizations seeking out, to take risk decisions around particular technologies. I think that shift has been pretty spectacular, actually, over a relatively short period of time, a few years. And I think that's all to the good, because for sure, as I sort of touched on before, the bank needs or ought to make a difference. But it's only going to be effective in doing that if it can work over time with other partners to leverage the capital that we have, to use an overused expression, and to draw in more capital. And look, if the private sector can do everything that's needed to be done, that's great too. Right? We don't have to be there. Our purpose is to fill in some of those gaps. But equally, we want those to be bankable propositions or risk-capable opportunities. And of course, there will be time. We touched on nuclear just now, where you suspect that the answer has to be quite a lot of public sector money, not necessarily lending, but grant, because of the sheer scale and uncertainty of these projects.
I wanted to touch on this as well. Obviously, you've worked with Treasury on setting up the bank initially. Then I noticed there was 21 people you were up against, or 20 when the kind of bidding was to find the chair. So yeah. Obviously you've been close to the corridors of power with this as things have gone along. How positive are you about government's commitment? Maybe this is the wrong question, Chris, but I'd be really intrigued to hear how you're feeling about government's commitment to, firstly, the sustainability agenda, and then maybe we could come to the levelling up part of this equation as well, and ask you about your insight into government at the moment and what it's thinking on these things.
It's a dangerous thing to say you have any particular insight into government, yeah, particularly after what is quite a short period of time, and whatever else one knows about government around the world, it is a complex affair. I was working with Treasury. That's one quite small part, important for sure, but small part of the overall government mechanism or machinery in this country. So, I'm not going to claim any fantastic insights. I mean, it was in passing absolutely fascinating to be working with the public sector in a way that I've worked quite a lot over the years with the local governments, but very little really with central government. So that was just fascinating to see some of that. And I've been very, very happy just to have had that opportunity without actually going on to be selected. And it was a very formal and proper process to be chair. So that's the first thing I guess I'd say. But, look, there's no question when you're there day to day about the commitment of individuals and indeed departments to move in this direction around net zero. And it's clearly part of what they're all thinking. What is quite hard, by the way, is for government, you see this written about, but it is quite hard for government to join itself up. They are quite disparate organisations. There's many parts to government. In total, it's huge. Getting all of that to work seamlessly is a big ambition. But is the intent there? Is there a lot of effort into it right across Whitehall? Yes, that's my sense. With respect to levelling up, I would say there's more variety of views on that subject, as you've heard elsewhere. I don't think that's any great insight. One of the reasons we've spoken very specifically about local and regional growth rather than levelling up is because I think that's a lot easier to kind of make sure that we know as an organisation what we're focused on, because it will be growth that we're hoping to drive. With that will come, you'd expect, particularly if you choose parts of the country or bits of, let's face it, there's plenty of deprivation in different parts of the southeast as well as there is elsewhere. But focusing on some of those matters, but via driving growth, we think we can make a difference.
Of course, the bank's headquartered in Leeds, which is just another example of how it can do that. I don't know where it's gone. Where is it in Leeds? Which particular?
Where's Leeds? Where north, mate, until you get there. It's okay. I'm going up there tomorrow, so I'm happy to. The great thing is the train usually stops there, so even if you drop it.
No, I was just wondering if they've announced where the building. I'm sure they have, but the government.
We've opened the building. We're up and running. We took a floor of a multi-let building that was, it was, dare I say, it was on quite a short contract because we don't know how big the bank will be.
Yeah.
Actually quite fun. It was. I talked about being on the other side of the balance sheet. It's quite fun actually finding myself negotiating a lease.
You should know. You should know all sides of it, though. That particular negotiation.
I think my colleagues at British Land would have been terrified at the thought of me negotiating a lease, but there we go.
Well, I just wanted to, before we kind of get on to a couple more questions, just wanted to. In fact, I've had loads of questions coming in on the Q&A now. I see that I've been ignoring. Let me just see if I should get to one. Well, here we are. There's one here. There's been significant underinvestment in rail infrastructure. It says here in Wales, but I think over many years across the UK in many ways. Would the Infrastructure Bank consider funding significant rail infrastructures to support? Here we have the Swansea Bay City region, as well as the Mid Wales and North Wales region. So obviously a particular focus on Wales there, but I guess that's a really interesting question about rail infrastructure projects, full stop.
Well, the first thing to say, and maybe the most important versus the question is the bank is committed to operate across the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've got a discussion on Wednesday while I'm in Leeds, actually, with one of the Welsh ministers. It's not actually on infrastructure. It's not on rail specifically, and maybe this reflects, we are still at early stages. We don't yet have a full strategy set out. I think the distinction I would make with respect to rail infrastructure, and that feels like it's an industry going through quite a lot of change at the moment. There are certain things which lend themselves to infrastructure lending. For example, actually, carriages, trains have been, as you know, financed, and that's quite tricky at the moment. The funding model for the physical railways themselves, the lines, is quite hard to figure out how you do that. But in principle, would we look at that? Absolutely, as part of our underlying mission.
Okay. I wondered if I could quickly ask you, before I move on to a sort of final round of questions, or what I've got you here as well. Obviously, catch up on real estate. Looking back now on that period of your life, just wanted to very quickly ask you, is there anything in particular you'd say you were most proud of that you did there as well at British Standard? Did it have something to do with sustainability and regeneration?
Yeah, I do look back at my time with BL with both fondness and pride. I think there are a number of things. I mean, some of the buildings we built, I think were terrific buildings of their time. And I am proud of that. I think some of if you look at the broader ESG initiative, I'm very proud of what we did on diversity from an industry that 12 years ago wasn't particularly diverse. Do I claim any great successful whole thing? No, but BL moved a long way. And yes, I think with the specifics of ESG and moving towards net zero, we were towards the front of that queue, and I think that's important for a big developer like BL to be doing that and making sure not just saying it, doing it. And I'm sure that Simon and the team will continue that impetus. After all, it does come back to that thing. A lot of people are setting out goals, but it's about delivering them. That'll be the challenge for my colleagues over the next number of years.
Absolutely. Now I have a kind of final question here that I just wanted to get you to put kind of go through this. What's the bank's key ambition? Would you say, Chris?
Look, at the end of the day, it will be the job of the chief executive, and I've now done a bit of both of these things. As chair, you have to be careful about not impinging too much onto the chief executive territory. But certainly from my perspective, I think we want to be an admired institution, one that people want to do business with. And I think that's quite a lot to do with culture around things like pace. If it's a complete pain to deal with, if it takes too long, that won't happen. So there's some cultural things which I think we will need absolutely to work on. And then in terms of the big picture, I think it'll only be clear kind of after a period of time, but will we be able to look back as an organisation, and hopefully more broadly, will people be able to look back and say they made a difference in the two areas that they were working in? I think if we can do that, and that difference to be material in the context of the balance sheet available to us, then I think we'll be able to look back and say, hey, we did a decent job. If we can't do those things, people didn't want to work with us. I think we're slow, bureaucratic, never take risks, then we'll have failed.
That makes sense. And it's a 3-year initial period, isn't it? With then, obviously politics changes a lot quickly, doesn't it? But it's a 3-year initial period for the bank.
I mean, the absolute intention, and this is very clear, and it should be clear in the legislation, but the Chancellor set out the plan that this would be a permanent institution, part of the financial structure of this country. Of course, no government can bind the subsequent government, but that's the intention, and that's the way that we will be running the business, with long-term aims as well as short-term aims.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris, and all the best with it. Best of luck with it too. And I'm going to now pass over to the team to guide you into what's happening next.
Thank you, Paul. Always a pleasure.
So thank you very much, Chris and Paul, and also to our audience for all your questions. I thoroughly enjoyed listening into that, from the challenges of being effectively a startup to the opportunities this will create for the country as a whole for the long term, hopefully. Looking ahead, audience, we'll be delighted to see you tuning into some of our other sessions today. So there should be some details up on your screen of what's coming up. We have UK Cities keynote, which is passed, and we're going in later to how can Croydon ensure its regeneration is inclusive. So we very much hope that we will see you there or later in the week. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.